Good evening to one and all. Welcome to the webinar on agriculture from poverty to prosperity by Foundation for Democratic Reforms. We are a think tank on public policy and governance based in Hyderabad. I am Maurya Krishna and I work here as a research associate. In keeping with today's times of lockdowns and working from home, FDR is organizing a series of webinars called Crisis as Opportunity, covering healthcare, agriculture, and big city governance. These webinars are aimed at not just shaping the public discourse, but also the public policy landscape. We are houseful today with 500 registrations. We've received more than 100 questions and we are enthused by the incredible energy and intellectual curiosity. Last week, we had a webinar on rejuvenating healthcare. Today, the topic is agriculture with focus on agriculture supply chains. Next week, we'll have one on big city governance. The coronavirus pandemic has exposed the fault lines in our food supply chain. Tomatoes usually sold for rupees 20 per kg, slumped to rupees 2 per kg in Mysore. In Punjab, the traders were not ready to accept the produce by the farmers and told them to store it with themselves. Azad Mandi in Delhi, which is Asia's largest mandi for fruits and vegetables and has about 23,000 transactions per day, was functional at less than 25% of its capacity. Consumers experienced high price volatility. We can go on highlighting the problems, but we recognize that this crisis is an opportunity. Our speakers for today will explore how COVID-19 can be converted into an opportunity to make agriculture more prosperous. We have with us an esteemed lineup of panelists. First, Dr. Alagh. He is India's leading agriculture economist and former Union Minister of Government of India. He was also the chairman of Institute of Rural Management, Anil, and he was also the chancellor of Gujarat Central University. Then we have with us Sri Ramesh Deshpande. He's the CEO of India Agriculture Group International based in the US. Then we have with us Dr. S.K. Pattanayak. He's a former secretary, Ministry of Agriculture, Government of India. He was the first mission director, Agriculture Mission, when it was launched in 2005. He's also held various positions in FAO. Then we have with us Sri Anil Epur. He is the founder of Confederation of Kisan organizations and he's also our board member. Last but not the least, we have with us Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan. He's a physician by training and a former civil servant. He's presently the General Secretary of Foundation for Democratic Reforms. Before we begin, I'll quickly go through the format of the webinar. First, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Jay. Then we'll have insights shared by Dr. Alagh, followed by insights shared by Sri Ramesh Deshpande. Then we'll have Dr. S.K. Pattanayak. And finally, the remarks by the various speakers. Before we keeping points, please ask questions using the chat box. Keep them brief. Mention the person whom the question is addressed to. Event that we might get disrupted, we have a backup and things should be sorted within 5 minutes. Now, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan. Dr. JP, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maurya and Bhavani. Both have labored very hard to put this together. And Keshav, who is coordinating our research activities. The beautiful thing about FDR is all our workers or professionals working either pro bono or for a very paltry stipend. There is no formal salary at this point of time. They're doing it as a labor employee. I'm deeply grateful to all of them for furthering the cause of India. Thank you, participants, and in particular, welcome to all the members of the distinguished panel. What I propose to do is make a very quick, very brief presentation. You will also see the slides. They have been already put on the web, therefore I think we have access to them. Many participants might have already seen them. Many points are very well known. It is just to complete the broader understanding and argument that we are putting some of the slides. Please forgive us if there is too much data. We try and minimize that. Let me start off by saying what I said in the last week's webinar on healthcare. We have a pre-existing crisis in agriculture. The crisis is not created by COVID, but COVID, as Maurya said, has exposed the fault lines much more vividly. Therefore, a starting point for discussion. We believe a crisis is a great opportunity, as Paul Romer said. A crisis is a terrible opportunity to waste. And if we actually look at it the right way, it could spur us into action and transform the agricultural sector. That's the spirit in which we are organizing these webinars. This is the second of the series. First is in healthcare. Today is in agriculture. Next week, this time, Saturday, is going to be in big cities because COVID crisis is largely a big city crisis, at least initially. So look at big city governance. This slide is about a well-known factor for economists and agriculturists, but not necessarily the general population. We all lament that we don't have much of a land mass. While we have about 16 or 17% of the global population, we only have about 2.3 or 2.5% of the global land mass. Who doesn't want land? But what we forget, we have about 12% of the world's agricultural land, 1/8 of the world's agricultural land. And we alternate between United States and India as to who is number one in a given year, because the extent of area that is cultivated in a year, it keeps varying because of seasonal conditions, our personal choices, some lands are kept fallow, so on and so forth. So we are consistently number one and number two in total cultivated area. And unlike many of the northern hemisphere countries, we have plentiful sunshine and reasonable rainfall and fertile soils. Therefore, agriculture could be a great engine for economic growth and incomes and employment, instead of becoming a source of misery and a perpetual cause of concern for those who care for India's suffering masses. Next slide, please. If you see the COVID crisis, most of the countries in the world, the rich countries generally suffered labor shortages. If you notice, the third one, the column there, of the 6 identified issues, these are all analysis based on FAO's parameters. The shortage of labor, most of the rich countries suffered. And if you see the second column, the low capacity of freight usage, most of the middle income countries suffered. India suffered every single one of these disruptions to supply chain. These two, plus processing and handling facilities are disrupted. Accessing the markets became a problem. Increased, already we have tremendous wastage of food and losses. It only increased. And of course, low price realization of farmers, which is an endemic problem, it only got worse. So we got hammered on every count. In fact, India is the only country that got hammered on every count. Vietnam didn't have shortage of labor. On other counts, they also had a problem on account of COVID. So as you see, many of these problems pre-exist COVID, but COVID only exacerbated them. Next, please. Already Maurya mentioned, and many of us familiar. These are all drawn from newspapers and elsewhere. You see tomato, every year we have disruption of supply chains. Prices shooting up to 50 rupees a kg, 60 rupees. Middle class housewives shouting from rooftops. Prices crashing to 1 rupee 50 paise. Farmers dumping them on the street and shedding tears. Onion, of course, is politically sensitive since 1977. Those of us who are old enough, the young people participating may not realize. But 1980 election, in some measure, was decided by the onion prices, and Janata lost and Mrs. Gandhi won that election. Since then, onions have been playing a significant role, outsized role in our electoral process, because we see price fluctuations. But see what happened now. Prices crashed to the consumer to about 8 rupees or so per kg. If you take the next slide, please, the marketing. Regulatory hurdles. There are two big things. One is the Marketing Committee Acts, APMCs of various states. We all know the problems, very monopolistic, inefficient, often leakage prone, missions, of government states. Some states
Is that little screen okay?
That is the second Act. This EC Act
Hello. This EC Act is a relic of the past. This was during the invoked in many countries in the world during wartime or famines. We are not in India during war or famine. This is suitable more to countries like Yemen today, or maybe Ethiopia in a massive famine, or Sudan. But by invoking EC Act left, right, and center, whenever the governments want to appease certain segments of the population or show to the people that they're doing something to contain the price rise, we're actually achieving the exact opposite results. The storage is discouraged because if you store more than X quantity, it's a crime. The farmer price generally diminished because the demand is artificially crushed because people can't buy to store. Value add is discouraged. Again, unless there is adequate storage and supply chain, value add will not happen, processing, etc. The futures market is obviously discouraged. In fact, it's banned in India right now. Volatility increases. I'll come to one or two slides. If you actually see these slides, I've drawn this from the Economic Survey of Government of India, 2019-20, placed before the day of the budget as a recall. The government gave these graphs. Price volatility has actually increased in case of various commodities, whether it is onion or dals or some other commodities which are brought in the Essential Commodities Act, or even sugar. Price volatility increased but not decreased. So the notion that EC Act is protecting the consumer, it is not supported by evidence. And therefore, we must look at the regulated practices, and therefore the recent action of the Government of India to significantly dilute Essential Commodities Act is very welcome and long overdue. But even then, the fact that they can still invoke the law in extreme circumstances is perhaps not the best thing that can happen. We have to prepare public opinion and then make policymakers aware of the pitfalls of overly regulatory mechanism in a very sensitive sector like agriculture. Next, please. Next slide, please. Then the other holy cow of Indian agriculture, the last one, the one before this, the minimum support price. If you notice, the minimum supported procurement, while they announced minimum support price for many commodities, in real terms, the only commodities procured in large quantities and therefore that has an impact on the pricing, etc., is paddy and wheat, or rice and wheat. 33% and 31% respectively is procured, and because of its massive operation, enormous cost, India is incurring about 1.5 lakh crores of rupees annually for this whole cereal supply chain. Now, what is happening is we are distorting incentives. India's per capita consumption of cereals is actually coming down. That is in keeping with the trend all over the world with modernization, where people want more nutritious, more balanced, more wholesome foods. And the demand for other foods, fruits and vegetables, eggs, milk, meat, fish, that is growing, and there the supply is not catching up with the demand. Therefore, any price inflation in agricultural commodities is largely a function of the perishable commodities and these commodities. And third is, because the farmer is sticking on to paddy and wheat, even though there is overproduction, oversupply, with a large glut in the market, there is genuine shortage, not only of the commodities I mentioned, the animal proteins and the dairy products and eggs and so on and so forth, but also, and fruits and vegetables, but also of the two other major foods after cereals, namely the cooking oil and dals, pulses, because India is largely vegetarian, even if people do eat non-vegetarian, some of them. It's only once in a while, but the primary source of protein is dal, vegetable protein, and of course cooking oil. Both India is the largest importer in the world. While in one commodity we have the largest glut of 80 million tons during peak time with FCI and state agencies alone, the other two major foods, the fats and the proteins, we are the largest importers in the world. It's not particularly an edifying picture for a country of India's size and complexity. Next, please. The supply chain. If you look at the agricultural supply chain, there are so many intermediaries. Typically, the farmer only gets 20 to 30% of the end price. You can see this flow chart, this graph there. If 100 is the price paid by the consumer, the farmer's share in case of fruits and vegetables is only about 12 to 15%. In case of cereals, etc., about 30, 35%, or maybe sometimes even higher. But on average, it's about 25, 30%, sometimes 20%. And there are long chain of intermediaries. Now, these are not bad people, but they operate on small volumes and high margins. That's where the problem is. It's an inefficient market chain. And in order to survive, they have to have significant share of the price jacked up, 11%, 14%, 15%, 12%, 17%, 11%, etc. The net result is we have a very inefficient long supply chain where the farmer is getting very little price and the consumer is paying very high price, and price volatility is very high. We have seen earlier already in the case of tomato and onion, etc. World over, perishable commodities are perishable commodities. But world over, the price volatility you see in India is not seen because we have a long and inefficient supply chain without any processing and effective storage and bad retailing. Next, please. And now processing, let me just make one point before we go further. Our processing is very inadequate, except in case of milk, because there is a reasonably decent dairy industry. 35% of the milk is processed. Meat, some 20% is processed. We require to do a lot more. Most of it is directly from the kabela, the traditional kabela to the consumer. Other commodities, typically less than 10%, even perishable commodities. In case of fruits and vegetables, less than 3%. Absurdly low level of processing. Therefore, volatility, wastage, more than ₹1 trillion of food materials are wasted annually because of inefficient supply chain. This gives you about the post-harvest losses. The slide is self-explanatory. We have significant losses in a variety of sectors. I already mentioned that. Next, please. Next slide, please. If you take the last 5 years, they actually have been bad years for agriculture. No, the last slide. If you take agricultural trade, India has had despite being a poor sector with small and marginal farmers, mostly illiterate, badly supported. Despite that, the farmers of India made India self-sufficient in terms of cereals, food grains. We now have world's largest surplus during peak times. And they made India largely secure in terms of food. And they have been also exporting and earning a decent revenue. But if you notice the last 5 years, because of the dramatic increase in the import of oil, cooking oil and dals, primarily cooking oils, and a few other factors, our trade surplus in agriculture fell by $20 billion from 2014 to 2016-17 in just 2.5 years' time. If you want to understand the crisis that the farmers faced around 2017-18 in India, this one number, when 15-16% of the GDP is agriculture, which is a small proportion related to the population-dependent agriculture, a $20 billion loss in the market effectively is a significant loss. This one number explains a lot of things. It has picked up a little bit, but even now, our trade surplus in agriculture is $10 billion less than it was 5 years ago. Next, please. Now, the next few are the proposals. Quickly, I'll run through them on the basis of the analysis that we had. One essential commodity is that the government decision, as I said, welcome. But I think it's time that we looked at repealing the law altogether. It does not mean that the government will not have strategic reserves of the major foods required. Government can always have them, a small quantity. You don't require 80 million tons of food grains. Most food experts say about 12 or 15 million tons of strategic reserve is enough in this day and age. We are wasting too much of money. And even that can be bought by competitive bidding in the market. You don't require a massive procurement process. Not that overnight you can do it. You can do it over a period of 5 years, that whole procurement. So EC Act can be repealed. The marketing laws, the government is in agreement, but they're not able to act decisively. Ultimately, we must remove the monopoly, remove entry barriers, and launch a national drive for multiple markets and competition and choice to farmers, not merely checking the tick boxes about the APMC Act amendment. Amendments are taking place, but ultimately we want the outcomes of markets available freely to farmers where there's a better price discovery. Next, please. Next, please. if you see MSP, I already mentioned the distortions. We are the world's largest importer of cooking oil and pulses. Therefore, impose moderate tariffs. Now, there are some moderate tariffs on cooking oil, but not on pulses. But for a reasonable period within the WTO framework, and pass on the money not to the treasury. The cooking oil tariffs are taken by the treasury. Some 35,000 crores probably annually is going to the treasury, not going to the farmers who are producing these crops. India needs to be self-sufficient. Therefore, for 3-4 years, give the farmers production incentives, and within 3-4 years, India will be self-sufficient. Remove all export bans wherever India is competitive and the farmers and traders are willing to export. And this off and on export bans is hurting us badly, because take Thai rice versus Indian rice. For the same quality of rice, Indian rice fetches a lower market price because our supply chains are not uninterrupted. It's very insecure. Because they were not steadily in the market, we're losing not only the market share, but also the market price. Next, please. MSP has distorted the incentives, as I explained. Therefore, over a period of time, we can't do it overnight. Farmers have come to rely on that. And therefore, they're raising these unremunerative crops because it's a moderate revenue. Assured is better in a safe crop rather than a high capital, relatively more risky, but much more profitable crop. Once incentives are not right, they're not going for the crops where there is a demand. Therefore, progressively over a period of 5 or 6 years, we can reduce with advance notice to farmers and prepare a mechanism by which the consumers directly get subsidy from the government instead of this elaborate, corruption-prone, leakage-prone, inefficient system from procurement to fair price shops. Because in India, food market works. One thing which is not realized by many people who are concerned about food security is food reaches every nook and corner of India. It's not the supply that's a problem. It's the affordability of the poor that is a problem. Therefore, we have wrongly diagnosed the problem, and therefore we want to procure, we want to store, transport, and have retail agencies and distribute and have a massive work in terms of regulation and all kinds of things. And we all know the amount of corruption and leakage in that. And therefore, let the money go directly to the pockets of the consumers, the poor consumers who deserve it, particularly in the women's Jan Dhan accounts. Let's not have this complex process which is both distorting agricultural incentives and leading to tremendous loss of money and recycling, the commodity bought in the market at, in the fair price shop at a sub-market price and immediately sold with the price arbitrage, and they in turn supply to the Food Corporation of India or some other agency and get the full money. So all this racket, well documented all over the country, it's going on. It's high time that we looked at it, we changed it. It can't happen overnight. It's a politically difficult thing, but unless we make a case and make the people realize both the consumers and producers can be protected without this massive and expensive program, we'll continue to labor under the misapprehensions and continue to indulge in wastage at the cost of agriculture. Next, please. Storage, one small point. We claim that we have significant storage, a small gap, which is not true, because government's own reports in 2010, etc., show that there's a significant shortfall of cold storage facilities in India and storage facilities in general. But that apart, a commodity can be stored by the small farmers only when they have the staying power. When there's price volatility, the farmers often do not have the ability to wait until the price turns to their advantage, because they always indulge in distress sale. They borrowed at usurious rates. They don't have money to sustain their families or to raise the next crop. And therefore, this one simple step, if you don't give pledge loans, storage in order to get a price advantage is simply not possible for most farmers. And once the stock is there, it's a low risk loan for the banks. And as long as adequate safeguards are there to guarantee that the stock exists, it makes no sense. Out of the total agricultural credit in India, only 1% goes to pledge loans. Net result is the farmer is suffering dramatically. He is forced to indulge in distress sale. If you notice, this whole presentation is not about improving production. That anyway we have to do, from irrigation to inputs to technology to extension, all sorts of things. But the basic premise is once the farmer gets a decent price and the markets are allowed to work, then the production problems can be sorted out much more easily. And the demand for these quality inputs and the desire to improve the productivity will dramatically transform agriculture. Therefore, today's study is not about science and technology of agriculture. It is about economics of agriculture, particularly in the post-harvest phase. Next, please. economies of scale. We have land ceilings for a variety of political and social reasons that cannot be touched. But that does not mean that we cannot allow aggregation of land. Already contract farming is allowed, but we're not aggressively pursuing some of these options, either pre-harvesting aggregation or post-harvest aggregation. These are critical in order for the entrepreneur to access capital. Capital formation in agriculture is actually falling. 80% is in private sector. Private sector capital formation is actually falling in India. Public sector is just in marginally, barely keeping pace with the GDP growth rate. So overall, there's actually reduced capital formation in a sector which is starved of capital, which is still sustaining about 47, 48% of the population. Unless you really aggregate, unless there are economies of scale, neither capital formation, nor infusion of real technology, nor access to market, nor post-harvest technology and processing, nor search for global markets, none of the, or processing, none of these will be real. They'll be only on paper. And therefore, we have to find mechanisms. One way we can consider is, can we impose agricultural income tax in case people go for large farms? That is allowed in the Constitution. There's no reason why we should exempt agriculture from tax as long as you allow aggregation and with certain safeguards. But we must think of innovative mechanisms to allow aggregation either in farming or in post-harvest technologies. Next, please. Compressing market chains. One of the earlier slides, you notice there's a long market chain whereby the farmer is only deriving 20, 30% of the end price. That apart, the long market chain is disincentivizing from storage to processing to value addition to search for export market. Everything is disincentivized. Therefore, we have very inefficient and weak market chain to the detriment of agriculture in general and price realization of farmer in particular. And therefore, we must allow the market chains. For a long time, there's a debate. There's enormous amount of literature on this subject. The traditional market share as a proportion may come down over time if organized retail chains are allowed. But as a quantum, actually, it's going to increase because India is at a stage where the overall retail market is growing by 16 to 18% per annum. India has the lowest share of the organized retail chains in the whole world. I have some numbers here. The note, there's no slide we put up here, but the note contains a table. I'll quickly read out the numbers. Brazil has 35%, Indonesia 30%, Malaysia 40%, Vietnam 45%, Thailand 40%, all middle income countries. China over 20%, Germany 80%, Singapore almost 100%, UK 80%, US 85%, Australia 60%. India, the retail chain, brick and mortar probably is only about 4 or 5%. If you include e-commerce, it's coming to 12%. We are the lowest among significant economies. This simply is not on. We have to move aggressively towards retail chains. Indian, global, doesn't matter. Whoever brings capital, technology, processing, and access to global markets. These are the requirements. Whoever does it, we must be agnostic about it. Next, please. And the advantages, boosting farmers share the price to 60, 70%, investment in logistics, boosting processing, improving the quality, grading and packaging. Then moderate consumer price volatility will come down, reduce price volatility tax, tap export markets, large employment. Overall, there's a net increase in employment. Wherever there's an organized retail chain allowed to function, there's a net increase in employment. And even if there is a small 1 or 2% decline in the traditional retail chains, they can easily be retrained and then given better employment, more secure employment in the organized sector. World over, it's been proven. China has shown it dramatically. Chinese retail sector employment has gone up dramatically in the past 20 years. They opened up in 1993 progressively. Since 2003, it's completely opened up. The retail employment actually has gone up significantly, not gone down. Next, please. With the right policies and incentives, agriculture can be a dynamic sector, not a long-suffering sector, impoverished sector, but it can end poverty, reduce poverty, create employment, and give farmers and consumers a fair deal. COVID crisis gives us an opportunity to rethink, and it's time that we honestly and systematically and in a very humble manner persuade those that matter, the people, the media, and of course, the most important, the policymakers and decision makers, to transform agriculture instead of lamenting, build on our strengths and overcome our weaknesses. Thank you. May I now request Dr. Y.K. Alagh, a leading agricultural economist, a lifelong fighter for the cause of the farmers, a man for whom these struggles have been very dear to his heart. He's been always supportive of interventions which are pro-farmer and pro-growth. We're grateful to you, sir, for joining us and delaying your age, and you're young in at heart. I know that, and young in mind. We're very grateful to you for joining us. Kindly give your reflections and your ideas and comments.
You already sketched it out very well, Jayaprakash. So it's really a question of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. I think, as you very rightly said, the real issue is covering the last mile in this reform that you're talking about for the agricultural sector. And it's absolutely correct to say that in spite of the COVID and all the problems we are facing, it is a sector which has possibilities even in this year, provided we have the proper policies towards it. I think it's really a question on covering the last mile on a very large number of very appropriate issues that you have raised. And that's where we seem to be facing problems. You might have seen the newspaper report today that in spite of all our grain, we are not being able to pass on more than 10 to 11% of the grain to the deserving people, according to the reports of the food secretaries, because of the many bottlenecks that we set up. And I've always said that, listen, in this COVID period, don't insist on all the regulations that we have, which is a point that you have been making. And it's not just a question of, the long-term reform will take place, but immediately covering the last mile. Now, I think you're absolutely right in saying that procurement is only a question of a few states and a few crops. Once upon a time, when I was the chairman of the APC, a young lady in a university seminar I was giving said, it is a single crop, single region model. And she was absolutely right. It really hit me. Good students always, push you at the margin. And the real question, as you say, is pushing markets, abolishing the forced ECA. Procurement is all right for a few crops in a few regions, and as you say, it needs to be phased down. But then we are not really being able to build up the supply chain for the other crops. Now, we've talked of the e-markets, but there are some very good studies which show that apart from chilies in Andhra, for example, the e-markets, the direct benefit transfer mechanisms are really not working. I went to give a lecture in Bhopal, and the direct benefit transfer scheme is supposed to be very successful there. I went there, and most of the farmers told me that, sir, basically the Artiya takes advantage of this. And they have really not been organized in the way in which you are saying. The most important issue that you have raised, I think, is extremely important, particularly in the COVID period, which is that you must rely on trade. As soon as you get out of these few procurement crops, and even there, please remember that when you're talking about the Kerala Red Rose or the Daud Khani wheat, the quality wheats and rice are really sold in the private market. They are not sold in the public market. And then the real issue is animal husbandry products, milk, fruits, vegetables. Now, transport is the other coin of trade. So as long as we have the COVID and, immediately, all of a sudden, some area is locked down, the farmer who needs both the railways as well as the trucks to transport a lot of these products, maybe sometimes up to 300 kilometers, sometimes only 100 kilometers, sometimes only a 50-kilometer range. Somebody has to look into the trade transport link and to see that when we lock down these things, we should make a special effort to see that the agricultural supply chain is maintained. Otherwise, a lot of what you say is not going to happen. Then, of course, there are the whole question of imports. And because of the urban lobbies, we tend to declare imports too soon. We don't really have the kind of retaliatory tariffs which other people impose on our exports to them. You gave the export figures. And particularly, we tend to always announce imports just before the sowing season. That gives a very negative signal to the poor farmer. I mean, suppose he is growing something where the procurement price is 120 rupees and the market price when he's growing it is about 200 rupees a quintal. Now he knows that when his crop comes in, he's not going to get 120 or 200 rupees, but at least he would like something like 140 rupees. For pulses and for other things, we declare imports at the wrong period, giving the negative signals to the farmer. And this has to stop. You have to take a balanced view of all of this and see to it that tariffs on imports are reduced in a regulated manner such that the farmer does not get disincentives. I wrote a report on pulses, and this was the major issue there. And for a couple of years, they did what we had suggested. But then again, we have started this whole business. Hum to ab import karenge to help the urban consumer when he complains of a moderate price rise. Now, the e-markets are going to be a big way of doing some of the things that you are talking about. And I think the Andhra model, because the e-market does work in the chili sector, there are some good studies. The Andhra Agricultural Commission with Radhakrishna has a full chapter on that. That is a model that we need to repeat in other parts of the country and see to it that the e-markets, which at present are captured by the Aratia and others, are able to give access to markets to the small farmers. We do declare that, credit is being given and so on, but in most cases, that credit remains with the banking system. It is rolling over the past debts, and the credit without collateral, which used to be a part of the cooperative system because the collateral was basically the standing crop, that is becoming more and more difficult now. I think that's a mistake. Now, they do say the FM makes declarations. The bank chairman say, I was sitting with my bank manager to get for my annual life certificate to get my pension. So I asked him, he said, Saab, wo sab to theek hai, lekin jab agar hamara wo bank loan kharab ho jaye, so when I get my inspection, I am blamed. And then there are charges made that I have helped one or the other person. I think the only thing which I liked in one of the last budget steps was that, as you said, we said that for the Jan Dhan accounts of self-help groups of ladies, uska jo collateral chahiye, government will take care of that. Now, these kinds of steps we need to take in a much larger way. And credit must be available for all the things that you are talking about in a far more relaxed manner with necessary collateral. As you say, the stocks can be a collateral. It is not just the public storage. There are a lot of now public-private storages. In fact, I know that the Singapore shareholding company, Temasek, has bought shares in private sector stock experiments in India, where the private sector gives stocks the grain and gives the farmer a Pershi, and that is a tradable Pershi. Now, these are the kinds of markets that we need to unleash on a very big way. And you're absolutely right. Public sector storage by itself is absolutely not enough to take care not only of the volume, but also remember the complexity of some of the things that you are talking about. Crops which have different kinds of staying power, which need to be handled in particular ways. Now that needs specialized storages, cold storages and other storages. And then aggregators. Now we did, I remember Kurian in 1998 in the Anand Declaration, and he said, Yogender, cooperatives are not going to succeed all over India. But maybe we can make companies of farmers. So I said, why not Kurian? So then we lobbied, and in the amendment to the Companies Act of 2002, the second amendment, I was able to push through the whole concept of a farmer producer company. Now, that was in the Ministry of Company Affairs. And I am a great supporter of the Ministry of Agriculture. But on this, I believe that it should not go to the Ministry of Agriculture, because the Ministry of Agriculture still has the old, its old mindset, the collector, the SP, the district agriculture officer. But the Corporate Affairs Ministry thinks of it in terms of corporate entities, a balance sheet, annual accounts, annual elections. So I'm still in favor. I think the last amendment that we have put in to bring the farmer producer companies back to the agriculture sector is a mistake. They should remain in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. And these are fascinating. I mean, I get telegrams from a farmer producer company somewhere on the West Coast in the Malabar saying, sir, we are now exporting in the coffee export zone in London. Now that's the kind of thing you were talking about, Jayaprakash. And we need to encourage those things. We need to provide credit for them. For 4 years, we didn't give credit to farmer producer companies. We gave credit to cooperatives, but the banks wouldn't give. I made a stink about that. Now I'm told a little more is happening. NABARD has opened a special window for FPIs, but even then, there are lots of problems in trying to sort out some of these issues. So, I think what you're saying is absolutely right. In everything that you have said, we need to cover the last mile. We know success stories. We need to replicate them. And even in this year of the COVID, I think agriculture is in fact a possible dynamic sector. We need to give it a little policy push. And you're absolutely right. There is absolutely no reason why we can't tax agricultural incomes. Many decades ago, I had written a paper for the case for an agricultural income tax, and they said we can't assess production. I said you can use presumptive taxation. Presumptive methods were known in many countries of the world. And then Pranab Bardhan had picked up the same argument and made Gandhi. And the case for an agricultural income tax is very clear, and it needs to be implemented. But thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for the very insightful comments. In a nutshell, what Dr. Alagh is arguing with the lifelong experience is we must liberalize agriculture. And as they say, enemies will take care of it ourselves, but please save us from our friends. The governments and the administration, they're our friends, but we require to be saved from them, their exuberance and their over enthusiasm. Let me cite very briefly a couple of instances I recall. If you take storage, today somewhere is mentioned. First of all, the government says there's only 10% gap, but actually the government's own reports say in 2010 or so, there's a 35 million ton gap. And we only added about 7 million tons since then. There's a huge storage gap. But just one instance, in 1984, sir, I was a young officer at the time, joint collector of Visakhapatnam, I think, steel plant. The cotton prices in India went up to 1,600 rupees a quintal, which was a decent price at that time. Suddenly, Government of India announced when the global price was running much higher than Indian cotton price, that they would import cotton, X number of bales, so many millions of bales. Within hours, the price fell to 800 rupees. I just wonder what will happen to the organized sector employees if suddenly they're told within 24 hours that their salaries in perpetuity will come down by 50%. There'll be a revolt on the streets of India. So I think we need to be saved from our friends. May I now request Sri Ramesh Deshpande, an innovator at Champion of the Farmers. He and Dr. Alagh share the same age chronologically. Both also share the same sharpness of the mind and love for the farmer. Sri Ramesh Deshpande worked in the RBI and later with the World Bank, has global experience and exposure. After retirement, he is devoting decades of his life in engaging with the government and policymakers in India to improve the lot of agriculture. So Dr. Alagh, kindly do stay back because there is a question answer session after this. Hundreds of questions have come from the participants. Sri Ramesh Deshpande.
Thank you, Dr. Jayaprakash. Thank you for inviting me here. And it's a great privilege to be in this panel, with Dr. Alagh, Dr. S.K. Pattanayak, and yourself, Your Honor, who has done so much work in public service, in farming and in civil service. So thank you very much for this opportunity. No,
Give me the.
Can you put up my PowerPoint and go straight to slide number, say, 13? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
We can hear you. We are on slide 13.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. See, I will not go all the slides of, we don't have time, but let us focus on the 3 or 4 main issues which Dr. Jayaprakash, Narayan, and Dr. Alagh raised. Basically we have to see how our agriculture supply chains are working and they are broken. This one slide tells you how poor extension, supply of inputs, and low productivity and outdated farming practices because the extension is not that effective. So basically there are very big inefficiencies in production. Hello?
Yeah.
You okay?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Please go ahead. We can hear you.
I said, but you, yeah, okay. So basically we had to take concrete actions. I mean, we have to take various initiatives to improve all the aspects of supply chain production and make it more efficient. The supply chain, there is a huge wastage. They say the post-harvest wastage for fruit and agriculture like 30%. Grain is more than 10%. Lack of storage, poor transportation, all that. We talked about it. Processing is although processing is emerging, but the supply of raw materials has not been consistent. And there are inadequate processing facilities. Lack of cold storage, cold chain is also a problem. And marketing, we talked about marketing. Now I want to talk about only 3 issues. One is APMC Act changes. You see, there is, so far only there is a model law in place and 2 states have passed this APMC Act and market law allowing for contract farming, and either Tamil Nadu and Madhya Pradesh. The problem is that it is actually making it more regulated in the process. See, the entire administration of contract farming now is left, you have to register the contract with either agriculture department or revenue department. The adjudication process is also left to revenue department. Now, if it is governmentalization or the public sector intervention in this contracting business, then which is between 2 parties, the producer and the purchaser, and they have different options. For example, they can notarize the contract. That's enough. If they want more legal protection, they can register with the regular registrar's office and not necessarily to agriculture department extension. And there is normal judiciary which will take care of the dispute, or the contracting parties can choose a private arbitrator, mutually acceptable arbitrator, who can settle this contract. So we have to really look at this question, whether this whole contract farming issue, which is important, as Dr. Jayaprakash said, that we had to get economies of scale, and we had to do two things. One is more efficient production, which supports services provided by the purchaser. The banking system is unable to provide that credit. Only 30% of farmers get credit. So it is the input supply, credit through input supply, credit through by the purchasers, and technology support by the purchaser make a lot of difference. But if this contract farming is made subject to regulatory practices, there can be delays, there can be corruption, there can be nuisance. So this point I think we should take up further. The second point I just want to comment, I don't want to go to my regular PowerPoint, because Dr. Jayaprakash has covered a lot of ground and Dr. Alagh has gone. The second point is about MSP. You see now, and in many countries, government is not in the picture to buy grains. And all the MSC question came out of this scarcity, grain scarcity business. There is a move now in the United States, but I don't say we are ready for that, but we should consider this option. Under MSP, government is able to reach only by limited produce. So there are limitations, budgetary limitations, storage limitations, demand limitations. So government MSP program reaches only about 6 to 10% farmers. 90% of the farmers have no access. So your point that MSP is only distorting the market is very true, and I absolutely support that. But now question is not about just buying at an MSP price. You see, it is also a question about protecting farmers' incomes. How do you give a chance? So risk insurance is an option. Now crop insurance has come in, number one. But now there is a new move to do revenue insurance or price insurance. The United States has introduced new schemes under which farmers can insure price of commodity. Of course, the market is well organized. You have Chicago Board of Trade, and we have a very organized storage system, the grading system, quality system, so it works. But India has to think, at least for big commodities, whether the existing crop insurance system could be amended to include price insurance. This is something which I have been writing to government. So far, there is not much movement. The third area is there is a new concept coming up, is ESG concept. You see, many corporations, especially in US and Europe, because ESG is a new dynamic. The new dynamic is rooted in corporate responsibility and accountability. For many companies, across the world, ESG means environmental factors, social factors, and governance factors. We have to take note of that. Food safety is important, environment is important, sustainability of agriculture is important, and therefore 3 criteria have been laid out. The ESG concept, which I think India, it has not yet been spread much in India, but it is now being deeply spreading down in Europe and USA. So one is under environmental factors, the producers are supposed to, in the supply chain, the producers are supposed to look at GHG emissions, energy efficiency of production, air and water pollution, water scarcity, biodiversity, and site restoration. That is one. Social factors are human rights issues, local community impact and employment, child labor, working conditions, health and safety, and governance factors. You see, the alignment of interest and the decision-making process. So ESG is a new market dynamic, and I think we have to focus on that in supply chain development. Introducing ESG concepts has become very important. Then Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan mentioned about focusing on making agriculture more market-based. That is absolutely important recommendations. Actually, GOI's recent economic survey, from 1929, 1920, it explicitly recognizes that it explicitly recognizes the invisible hand of the market as the norm for future economic policies that India would focus on in order to create wealth across the economy. But agricultural policies are still far away from invisible hand of the market. Input prices are distorted. MSP distorts market prices, and there are inefficiencies in production. So how do you transform, how do you begin to turn agriculture into agribusiness through market forces is an important issue. And I think taking it further, Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan's various points, that we have to focus that invisible hand of the market should be the key theme for future agricultural reforms. Now, the fourth, Dr. Alagh mentioned about lack of access to credit. Actually, there are not enough products. The whole system is stuck with old products. There are no, this banking system is not unable to reach for more than 20 to 30% of farmers. 70% still depend upon informal lenders. Number two is pledged loans are absent. Term credit is not happening, that affects capital formation. But most important is that we have NABARD preparing potential linked credit plans. They remain on paper. You see, they are not translated into actual projects except very few, that is government budgeted programs. But private sector is not in there. Project preparation support is very minimal. And then after developing projects, the building supply chains require integrated development, mutually supportive development. We don't have mechanisms to get area-based projects prepared, analyzed, then inviting banks and investors to do that, and develop the project finance proposals, whereby there is equity, there is debt, there is bond, raising resources in the market. So there are various options. We are not using those options to develop supply chain. So this is one big gap, that in NABARD is giving refinance to banks, and we talked about limitations on bank extending credit. Term loans are very limited because it requires mortgage facility and they are isolated. The fourth point I want to bring to your attention is the whole subsidy program going. You see, these subsidies are, of course, fertilizer subsidies is a big issue and to take time. Look at the economic, you are talking about export, look at the economic cost of products which are exported. I mean, we may be exporting water and fertilizer at cheaper price than what it costs to the country. So there is hardly any discussion going on that what is the economic cost of the agricultural produce we are doing and the supply chains are. So time has come to remove these distortions and make agriculture market oriented. I think I should stop here, then we can go for further questions and answers. I have several other points, but let us go to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your insightful comments. You have taken us to a futuristic thing. Income insurance is something that we should look at least in the future, because so far we have failed even to have the normal crop insurance, which is basically crop insurance in most cases. And you brought the perspective of climate change and ESG. And of course, you're urging us to get the whole subsidy administration. And unless we look at the economic cost, the society will not get the best of the inputs that we bring. Thank you for those very cautionary words. Before I invite Dr. Pattanayak, my apologies for the delay in between because of the technical disruptions. Despite our best efforts, those glitches we did not overcome. And therefore, we will extend this by another 15-20 minutes so there's enough time for question and answer session. After Dr. Pattanayak, there will be Q&A. And in between, Anil, Epur, a noted agricultural expert, particularly agricultural trade and marketing and post-harvest processing and so on, and supply chains. He'll make a few comments and take a few questions too. Dr. Pattanayak is a former Secretary of Agriculture until recently, just about a few months ago. And therefore, he's very familiar with what's happening in the government in recent months and years, with the benefit of that understanding. Plus, he worked in the agriculture sector for a number of years. Thank you, Dr. Pattanayak, for joining us. your comments and your response.
Thank you, Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan. And I'm really very privileged to be associated with this webinar this afternoon. And I must thank the Foundation for Democratic Reforms to have prepared such a beautiful paper. In fact, it is a very well-researched paper, as if written by professionals. The team of young people assisting you deserve commendation.
Thank you.
I also feel very privileged to be on this panel, especially because Dr. Y.K. Alagh, who has been such a tall personality. Sir, we were very young officers when you were holding the supreme position. So I'm really feel proud that I'm on the same panel. I also feel privileged that Sri Ramesh Deshpande, who has years of experience in agriculture and has taken his experience abroad, is also sharing the dais. And thanks to Anil Epur, because he has been encouraging this foundation to go in for, in a very big way to advocate new policies for the government. So having said this, I think I will confine myself to the PowerPoint presentation made by Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan. I cannot agree more with what has been stated by him and the distinguished panelists. But I would like to nuance the discussion in terms of maybe all those recommendations may not be accepted in totality, because India is a big country and the interest of every segment of the population needs to be protected. Having said this, there was a talk about the Essential Commodities Act. It should be done away with. That is what Dr. Narayan mentioned. You all know the government has very recently, on June 6th, came out with 3 revolutionary announcements. And I would say this is a watershed moment in the history of Indian agriculture, because for the first time, government recognized that the EC Act is archaic and needs to be done away with. Of course, it was very bold, but there is a lurking fear that in the name of, national importance and the extraordinary circumstances, this act can be, kept on hold. But still then, taking away commodities like cereals, pulses, oil seeds, edible oils, onion and potato is a huge signal to the private sector to invest in agriculture. And why I say this, when these commodities do not come under the purview of the Essential Commodities Act, they also do not come under the purview of what is called the stock control limits. That means private processors and those who are supply chain specialists, they can invest in infrastructure to store these produce. And when we speak about investment in agriculture, agricultural investment can only spur agricultural growth. That means the contribution of private sector is important, and private sector will only contribute provided it knows there is a steady environment for it to operate. And this particular signal is used, and I think we must encourage. Of course, our intention would be to do away with altogether, but the Indian market is, very sensitive. Though we may say that onion need to be removed, but when onion prices touch 40 rupees or 50 rupees, it becomes very difficult. Let me tell you, though onion is so volatile, we produce much more onion than what we consume. We produce 24 million tons of onion, and our requirement is only 17 million tons. So we have a huge surplus. In fact, we export onion to a big extent. So despite having a surplus of production, yet it results in price volatility, calls for different type of solution rather than just putting a ban or things like that. Having said this, let me move over to the next recommendation, which is that of marketing laws, removing monopoly and all, which is very welcome. In fact, government has been so sensitive that on June 6th, they brought out the Farmer Producers Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Ordinance. In fact, it actually, it did not ban the trading in APMC, but it brought out alternative marketplace where people are free to take their produce other than the APMCs for trading. And it also recognized the electronic trading platform. That means if you are a food processor or if you are an aggregator, you can launch an electronic platform, register the farmer in that platform, enter into trading directly with them. So farmers can trade outside the APMC gate. And this is very revolutionary, which has happened. But having said that, we must also understand that before this particular act or ordinance came into being, it was not that everything was going to the APMC market. The presentation made by the foundation shows that hardly 40% or not even 40% of the total farm produce actually goes to APMC. In fact, for certain commodities, it goes to 30 to 40%, but most of it is only less than 15%. So therefore, farmer already had an opportunity to trade other than the APMC. So it calls for a bigger alternative thinking, that is investment in post-harvest infrastructure, which has been rightly pointed out. So this is what I want to say. I don't want to say much because time is short. The third aspect which was highlighted, that relating to external trade, there was a recommendation. Whatever I agree with, I am not commenting, but whatever I feel I don't agree with fully, I'm only commenting on that. There has been a mention that impose moderate tariff for imports. Now this goes against the grain of trying to promote the Indian farmers in a big way. We are truly having shortage of oilseeds and pulses in this country. So if you have a liberal tariff for imports, then we will be flooded. In fact, that is what happened. When the oilseed mission was launched in the early 80s, India was more or less got self-sufficiency in oil. But our consumption kept on increasing. And when we opened our floodgates for the imported palm oil to come with almost zero duty, the palm oil consumption got so much so, today 75,000 crores worth edible oil imports is done into this country. A similar phenomenon was taking place even a few years back with pulses. That is why pulse production kept on reducing, and it was 17 million tons in the year 2016 and 17. The tur dal, the red lentil in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana touched a high of 200 rupees a kg. Then the government was very much put up and they wanted that our production should go up. So when our production should go up, we put mechanisms in place. For that reason, the MSP also to some extent helped us in giving a signal to the farmer that if you produce, if MSP, not for MSP declaration sake, but if MSP is backed by actual procurement, then farmer will get the confidence to produce within. And that is how 17 million tons of pulses which were produced in 16-17 rose to 24 to 25 million tons. And consistently today, the production of pulses in India is 25 million tons, which is more or less matching with the total demand. Your presentation also has made that projection of 25 million tons of pulses. So therefore, we need why I am saying this is because we need to use our tariff regime in such a way that it should incentivize domestic production. And to that extent, the observation is correct, but we need to correct or calibrate these tariffs. I do entirely agree with you that we must remove all export bans. Unless we remove all export bans, we will not know to what extent we are competitive in the global market. And our farmers are very resilient. They will definitely step up the production. Coming to MSP, as I'm taking a cue from what I said earlier, MSP should be progressively reduced. I agree entirely with you. But MSP cannot be fully removed because the National Food Security Mission has computed the requirement of food grains under the Act, which needs to be provided by the government to the vulnerable sections of this community. We must not forget that the India harbors the largest number of food insecure people in the world. When I say food insecure, it also includes nutrition insecure, because the new definition of food security also embeds in that the nutritional security. So therefore, that has to be looked into, plus the strategic reserves. It's not that, because you should know that though rice is produced more or less around the year, wheat is produced only once in the country. So that means we have to wait for a full 1 year season to get the next wheat crop. And if there is shortage in India for either wheat or rice, no country in the world can supply to India. Because China, which is again a great producer, already imports both these crops. And wheat can be imported, but rice cannot be imported. So we must also recognize the need for the cereals, though we have been telling our agriculture is cereal centric and we should divert. So with that caveat, of course, MSP should be progressively reduced. It should be used as an instrument to incentivize certain states to grow certain crops and certain states not disincentivize to grow certain crops. I do agree also about the observation that today MSP has become a political tool. There is no point in accepting, with due respect, Dr. Swaminathan's recommendation that you should give A2 plus FL plus 50%. Because that is the problem. If you're giving so much, then people will only produce rice and wheat and they will produce nothing. So therefore, instead of telling, I'm telling it more openly and pointedly. So we should give some margin after the cost of production. So this is where I would like to set right the MSP. And secondly, demand. There is an observation on demand-based production. If we allow the demand-based production to continue, then Indians will continue to eat more oil. Edible oil, the average edible oil consumption in India far exceeds the global average. It is not at all healthy. So let us not have this, because people will demand more oil, more fried items, and that is not healthy. Similarly, they will demand more starchy food, which is also not good. So therefore, we must promote millets. We must promote, because millet is one area where our forefathers were producing it. It is a climate smart crop. It is climate resilient. It needs little water. We must promote them and we must introduce in our food system. So I stop there, my comments on that. Then I go to the next item. So the next item is, you have mentioned about economies of scale. And you have also made very good that the share of retail chain in India is one of the least in the world. The aggregation should also be, to a considerable extent, exempt from certain taxation and things like that, which I do agree, because after all, he is not adding any value. So why is he paying? Just because he is aggregating, he needs to pay tax. I think it's a very good suggestion, and we must impress the policy planners to do that. Then compress the market chains. The compressing of the marketing chain is what was, which is very much necessary. In fact, there was a old World Bank study which says that tomato changes hands 32 times before it reaches the mouth of the consumer. So from the producer to the consumer, it was changing so many times. Of course, it is no more 32 times. Today is maybe 8 to 10 times, but we need to further compress it. And this can be accomplished by the 5th June new ordinance. The one, of course, I did mention is about the APMC reforms. The other one is a Contract Farming Act. In fact, in other words, we want to promote contract farming, where the farmer can directly enter into deals with the agro processors, with aggregators, with anyone, with a trader, with a service provider. In fact, there's a broad canvas under which this is. So this is a very good thing. How it unfolds is something which we have to see, but definitely this is something which we need to do. Then it comes about removing entry-level barriers for global retail chains, which is a very good thing. I think for agriculture sector, so far as investment from agriculture, nothing much has been done. So we need to look that. One possible comment on storage and pledge loans, which has been mentioned. In fact, we do have a framework for that. We all know that there is a authority called the Warehousing Regulatory and Development Authority. Now, there where the warehouses are registered, then they're regulated. Very recently, government said that if the farmer brings the produce to the warehouse, to this particular registered warehouse, he will get a warehouse receipt. And this warehouse receipt can be traded. So this was earlier in physical form, it was traded in terms of it is called a negotiable warehouse receipt. But now it has become a ENWR, means electronic negotiable warehouse receipt. The farmer can store his produce up to 6 months. and he will be eligible for interest subvention scheme. That means he gets a concessional loan for the value of the goods stored there. I think it has not got much traction, but with the new law which is going to be enforced, this will definitely see a lot of weightage given to it in the coming months. So it is a sleeping giant, but it will, I think, well wake up now. A small comment on the farmer producer organization. In fact, we must compliment Dr. Alagh for making, he has mentioned that in 2002, it was his efforts for which he recognized the need to ensure that agricultural commodities are traded and a company is required for that. The Companies Act was amended. But of course, though it was amended, we never saw much interest of the private sectors to go for a couple of reasons. When I was Secretary Agriculture, sir, I can tell you that I found if I am a farmer and I trade, I am not giving income tax. But if I am a farmer producer company and I trade and give it, I am subject to income tax because I am a company. So I prevailed upon the government, and it was only in 2017 budget that the government said that the turnover of a farmer producer company, which is up to 5 crores, if it does not exceed, they will be free from income tax. And a logical step of that is last budget, the government came out with a big scheme called 10,000 FPOs to be set up in this country, where farmers have got some negotiating power. They will be truly empowered. It's a very good thing because by producing, of course they get subsidy, but they get equity capital for that company also. Up to 10 lakhs the government gives. Similarly, they also get the what is called the credit guarantee also. So this is something which will definitely take time for it to have the impact, but it's something a very right direction the government has taken. I can possibly give the example of a very successful FPO in our country. It was perhaps the biggest. It is called Sahyadri FPO, Sahyadri Farmer Producer Organization. It's near Nasik. The type of infrastructure, the scale of operation will outbid even an Israeli or a Netherlands farm. Even people from Israel and Netherlands come to see it there. And it's all run by farmers. And they have not taken any subsidy from the government. They've stood on their own leg. So why I am narrating that example, this is what Dr. Jayaprakash narrated. You liberalize agriculture, you will find it successful. Our farmers are not really archaic people. They can compete with the best in the world. So therefore, I feel that this is something which we must do. Now coming to Sri Deshpande Sahab's observation, I have one particular observation, sir. Sir, you have mentioned just now that perhaps the new contract farming gives a lot of power to revenue authorities. It is not given, no power is given to revenue authorities. The power to adjudicate is given to revenue authorities only when there is a dispute. That means if I enter into the contract still remains a private contract. Under the existing Indian law, the contract has to be enforced only through the Indian Contracts Act. That means going to civil court. That civil court will take more than 3 years, 4 years, 30 years. So the farmer will be really facing problem. To avoid that, the power of dispute settlement has been conferred on the local SDO. You may not agree that that is the best possible alternative, but well, that is the fastest which we can do. And with little bit of intervention from local bodies and local people, I am certain the resolution will take place. So to that extent, it is good. Arbitrators charge very much, sir. Indian farmers cannot afford arbitrators, sir. This is what I thought I must tell you. But otherwise, the revolutionary thinking of ESG concept to be incorporated is good. And I think we must also examine that is futuristic. And we must have a lot of technology infusion, which should take place in the agricultural supply chain. Supply chain management and value chain both have to go hand in hand, and therefore the use of technology is also equally important. With these observations, I stop here. I think I would be more getting enlightened from the participants of this webinar than what I know myself. Thank you, Dr. Narayan, for giving me an opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Pattanayak, for those very thoughtful insider's perspective, because you understand you've been very much part of the thinking in government in the recent past. We're grateful to you for that. Just a few quick clarifications before we move on to question answer session. My apologies, when I said moderate tariffs, the accent is not on moderate, it's on tariffs. so that the free trade wars do not criticize. All I'm saying is tariffs must continue to protect, but let not the money go to the treasury that requires production subsidy incentives to the farmers so that we can sell sufficient. The second, I think we do require food security, but what is the meaning of security? First of all, I'm not talking of reduction of MSP, I'm talking of reduction of procurement. 20% per year over 5 years, slowly phase down procurement. Whether food security is met by massive procurement, storage, transport, distribution, and retail fair price shops, or do we have enough sense of confidence in ourselves with the recent experience that we don't have a requirement of all this? The markets actually work, they reach the people need money, that is the real problem. Let us supply them money. That the people require support is not disputed. What is the form of support? Perhaps if we phase down the procurement over 5 years, we will know if really the poor are getting the food as long as money reaches their pockets. Maybe we'll have experience. I don't think we should dramatically change anything, but progressively I think we can change it. Particularly with the huge grain surpluses in India or consistently good production. Even this year, just before this webinar, we were looking at 300 million tons of food grains production this year, another record production. So I think we are doing pretty well. I think many experts believe that Indian production is going to meet our requirements. There perhaps will not be massive shortages. And the last point, millets, I entirely agree with you, we have to encourage. But again, I think market is responding. In many cities now, the things that are regarded as inferior foods, now you have entirely millet foods and millet doshas, millet. So I think we must trust the people. I don't think government can dictate to people what they eat. I think the society will figure out mechanisms. With these caveats, may I open it to question answer session? Anil, you will come in later and some other questions. Okay, quick, Bhavani and Maurya. We have a barrage of questions, large number of questions.
Excuse me, Dr. Jayaprakash. Hello.
Yes, sir.
Can I get 3-4 minutes? I want to go back to my PowerPoint and make some.
Shall I go back? Come back to it later. We'll take a few questions then.
Thank you.
Right. Bhavan.
Thank you, Dr. JP, for the concluding remarks. I would also like to thank all our panelists for such wonderful and insightful presentations. We will now move on to the Q&A session. We have a lot of questions coming in from the participants. We'll try our best to accommodate as many questions as possible within our limited time frame. Our first question is to Dr. Pattanayak. A robust food processing sector acts as a crucial link between agriculture and industry to enhance growth and productivity. Why is Indian food processing industry still nascent, and what are the key policies that have to be implemented to strengthen this link?
Dr. Pattanayak, food processing.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think, see, Dr. Narayan has himself pointed out in the presentation that very little of the perishable farm produce is processed in this country. In fact, that is why the loss is close to 1 lakh crores, and therefore we need to invest in food processing. Why then food processing has not really developed? See, food processing can only develop provided the private sector invests. The private sector was not itself very sure about the quantum, that is total requirement of the raw material which is needed for the factory, can really be sourced. That is why they had this problem. Secondly, that quality. For example, suppose I am making potato chips, or suppose, then the chip variety of potato was not available in this country, so nobody was investing. Now, when the chip variety of potato started getting developed, then only the potato chips were made in India, and therefore the potato is not so much of a problem right now. Today the problem is of onion, the problem is of tomato, the problem is of so many other. So therefore, we need to create that ecosystem or the enabling environment for it. And the essential point which we are making today through this webinar is basically that once we have all this in place, definitely food processing will come in a very big way to India. Maybe 2 to 3 years from now, India will be really a big, very big food processor. That's what I'm saying. If all these recommendations which have been made comes to fruition.
Thank you, sir.
Next question.
Our next question is to Dr. JP. Telangana recently brought agricultural reforms where farmers can avail various benefits only if they produce the crops suggested by the government. Is such an intrusive intervention necessary? And if not, what other tools can be used to bring about the desired result?
I wouldn't call the Telangana government's measure a reform. What they're doing is, as many people are aware, Telangana is the first state in India which is directly giving farmer support per acre. Now I think 10,000 rupees, last year it was 8,000 rupees per acre, which is very significant. What they're saying is this support is conditional on the crop you raise. I think as a principle, if the government is saying that we support you, but there are certain conditions which are necessary in the larger public interest, you cannot fault that. Where I have some concerns is the government deciding what crop the farmer should raise. That may not be the best area because the government may not have the market information. And we may not know how the demand and supply will shape up in the next 6 months by the end of the crop or whatever. And it may actually lead to tremendous political and economic dangers. Instead, if some outlines of what can or cannot be done is given to farmers who receive support, namely, if you receive, let's say, government's extra subsidy 10,000 rupees, you cannot raise paddy because A, there is surplus production of paddy. Paddy crop, B, paddy crop guzzles water in a water-starved country. Therefore, it's a perfectly reasonable thing to say, don't go for paddy. B, you can say you must mandatorily go for drip irrigation, better water management practices. So certain broad outlines which are much more socially productive and which have lasting value rather than fluctuating patterns. No, if you say chili only must be raised, 3 months down the line you may find chili is overproduced in India and the price crashes. So instead, if such conditions are imposed, water guzzlers are prevented, water management is mandatory, and maybe even encourage the farmer producer organizations through the subsidy. Alter the behavior rather than dictate the crop. But the broad principle of imposing certain conditions for helping farmers, it is conditional support. Now, Latin America has perfected that art. I think there's nothing wrong as a principle.
Thank you, sir. So this question is for Dr. Y.K. Alagh. So multiple people have asked this question. So India succeeded in milk revolution on the with cooperatives at the forefront.
Will you check that?
Yeah, he's Alagh sir is there. He's online.
Yes.
Dr. Alagh, can you hear us? Sir, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Alexa, kindly unmute and then.
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Yes. Sir, so the question is, milk revolution was a success in India and the prices of milk increased and the dairy farmers got remunerative incomes. Why couldn't this success be replicated in other commodities? Was it the institutional structure or was it anything else?
Right question to Dr. Alagh from Gujarat.
Yeah, you see, it's a very good question because not everywhere will you have the conditions with which the cooperative started in Anand. It needed a special kind of farmer leadership, Tribhuvan Patel, and Kurian himself saw that. So that is why the Anand Declaration in 1998, we talked about the farmer producer companies because he was worried that as you try and spread it elsewhere, it would again become a kind of bureaucratic thing. And what we really wanted was that it remains in the Department of Company Affairs because whatever you say, they have the culture of a balance sheet, a profit and loss account, auditors, annual elections. So that was to be encouraged. And I think these different forms of cooperatives now, as it was pointed out in the discussion, both by Deshpande Sahab and Pattanayak Sahab and Jayaprakash, it didn't spread as much as we wanted to. But mind you, our records on farmer producer companies are quite poor. I know a very large number of farmer producer companies which are not registered with the government. And NABARD is recognizing that. So in its business plans for the next round, they have provided for a separate window, a large amount of money for refinancing these. So I think this is a kind of thing which is on the make. I think it is spreading. Generally, the experience has been, this is a point I think that Jayaprakash was hinting at, that wherever farmer producer companies have been backed up by businesses. For example, the Tatas did iShakti pulses in Pudukkottai, initially in Tamil Nadu. Now that model has spread, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, and so on. I think these kinds of newer forms of organizations, farmer organizations linking up with private sector, with export organizations. I was mentioning the coffee exchange. They have tremendous kinds of possibilities. Also, I believe in the storage business. Now, Sahyadri was mentioned. The Sahyadri gentleman came to me in Ahmedabad. He took an appointment and he gave me a presentation. He also brought some nice agricultural goods for me. And I sent him to meet the PMOs and the Planning Commission. And I think he is now really making waves. Now, these kinds of experiments we should really support in a much larger way. They are unfortunately still much smaller than what we want them to be. And I think that's the point of this webinar.
Sir, to this, I would like to ask a follow-up question directed at Mr. Anil Epur. Oh, sorry.
If I may add a couple of perspectives to add to Dr. Alagh's response. Dr. Kurian throughout his life fought for cooperative autonomy. All serious cooperators who are experienced in the sector, they recognized that cooperatives being controlled by government every step of the way. Kurian used to say, the registrar of cooperatives is the Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara. He creates, he nurtures, he destroys. Unless that is changed, cooperatives cannot function. All his life, Kurian and many other cooperators in the country, they fought against heavy odds to achieve success. One of FDR's important initiatives in this respect, inspired by Kurian, is fighting for constitutional recognition of cooperative autonomy. I always believed it was implicit in the Constitution, but we had to make it explicit. It's the result of that effort that the 97th Amendment has been now incorporated in the Constitution, whereby the protection given to societies and trade unions is now available under the Article 19(1)(c) cooperatives. The second part is, what is the purpose of cooperative organization? As Dr. Alagh pointed out, apart from the romance of farmers coming together and collectively organizing and managing themselves, it is about facilitating scale, capital, technology, quality management, and marketing and branding, including export markets. None of these things can be done individually or on a small scale. Whereas on a large scale, every one of these can be attempted depending on a comparative advantage. Now, wherever cooperative method works, fine. Otherwise, as Dr. Alagh has brought in, the farmer producer organizations or corporatization or the retail chains or 100 other mechanisms, but basically allow aggregation either pre-production, and if pre-production is not possible, post-production. In case of dairy, it's the post-production aggregation, because it's the millions of small producers who are supplying milk. Once they supply, from there onwards is aggregation. So that is the basic principle. If cooperatives work, fine. If that form doesn't work, let's not worry, because we already did immense damage to rural leadership in many pockets of India. Only some parts of Western India, etc., are still privileged to retain that leadership. In many other parts, we, for a variety of reasons, that leadership dried up. But let's find other means. But basic principle is honest and transparent aggregation to bring in efficiency and value addition in the chain.
Sir, just a follow-up question to Mr. Anil Epur on this. Sir, we've talked about the need for business backing and the requirement of private investments. So if I were an entrepreneur, where should I put my money in the agriculture sector? Many comments have also come. People want to know where they can put their money in the agriculture sector.
That's a difficult question to answer as it is. But the point is that unless you have the systems in place and the structures, you shouldn't put any money in. You should really be looking at, as Jayaprakash mentioned, have a successful FPO so that you have a minimum amount of size and you have enough market linkages and you're part of the supply chain of an organization, whether it's a corporate, whether it's an exporter or a processor. Unless you have that linkages, putting your money into this business is throwing your money down the drain. We have had experience over the last 40 years, 50 years of doing this until the late 70s, you had some supply chains. Afterwards, you had a lot of problems, and most of the private companies have stopped having linkages with basically the contract farming. Now, hopefully with this new law, which is still not very good, but if it comes through, maybe the companies will start reaching out to people to supply them products. If that comes through, then yes, the entrepreneurs have a very good chance of getting into any product, whether it's horticulture or whether it's spices or whether even some sort of a value-added cereals. They could get them together, but preferably as an FPO, have enough size, enough scale, so that you can do the preliminary processing, you can add some value at the local level, and then supply to the whoever it is that wants to buy from you. You need to have scale, you need to have local value addition, and you need to have basically the right product at the right time.
Thank you, sir.
What Anil is saying is, don't wear your heart on your sleeve. Don't invest romantically.
I think there's, I would like to make a point on this, Jayaprakash,
Yes, sir.
if I may.
Please, please.
You know, one of the problems that we create is that a lot of our markets are actually in small towns. But because of certain definitional problems and the politics of remaining a panchayat, we still call them rural areas. So the large-scale investment that you are saying in these market towns, where the farmer, she brings in her produce, first stage processing, and further development, that is really not taking place, also because of these kinds of definitional problems. Now, these are called census towns. Now, many of the states are calling these so-called villages census towns. And that means that the entire infrastructure of backing them up with investment for first stage processing becomes available. As long as you're a village, the banking system and all the credit and promotion systems are not there. So I think this is something that we need to do, which is more an administrative thing, because it's basically people like you, Jayaprakash, you know, the IAS officers who have to see to it that these places which are really towns are given the facility of investment in agriculture related issues, not on-farm investment. One is talking about, you know, the processing, the transport, the linking up, the supply chain, the kind of questions that we have been discussing. I think that's a very major institutional reform. Some states are doing it. Punjab has to an extent done it. And I think it helps in moving over from the wheat economy. Some other states are also doing that. We have done it in Gujarat.
Thank you, sir. I hope Dr. Pattanayak will make note, and from Delhi, he'll be our ambassador to making these things happen. Okay. Next, Bhavani.
Yes, sir. Our next question is to Shri Ramesh Deshpande. The ENAM portal has seen a high number of registrations, including farmers, sellers, and traders. However, the interstate trade through this channel has still remained very low. Why is this so, and how can we rectify this?
Well, that is I think there are 5 key principles for effective supply chains. You see, we have an e-market and we have farmer here, but in between links are still very undeveloped. First of all, the way our supply chains are organized, there are 5 principles. Be thoroughly familiar with the entire production and supply chain. You see, there has to be, government, there has to be on-site inspections, there has to be quality controls, there should be environmental aspects, and all this together, supply chain should be first organized. The second principle is vertical integration and consolidated supply. So e-market may be there, but unless you have integration and consolidation or aggregation of supplies, that is not going to happen. Third is, and this is among the producers or marketers, you have to create win-win relationship within the supply chain. Right now, supply chains are working on a very ad hoc basis. There is no proper, there is no, supply chain is an integrated approach. It starts from the production side till the market, and every stage is important. And those stages don't get monitored. And then the another thing is that there is no standard grading. There is no storage facilities which can certify that the grade is right, and that so if I'm in Punjab and I have to buy a product in Tamil Nadu, how do I know what the quality of product is? What am I getting? And so therefore, unless we have standardization of grades, standardization of quality, standardization of the whole process, checking of whole process, monitoring of the process, verification program for every supply chain, e-markets were very difficult to do. So what is going to happen now is that big traders who have this facility can be using the e-NAM, but rest of it. So I think we have to give attention to macro level supply chain development, and that is very weak. Unless the micro level or supply chains are strengthened, e-market or even if you widen the markets by reducing the monopoly or abolishing the monopoly of FPMCs, if there is no structure and there are no organized supply chains, e-NAM is not going to. So I think what we really need to is that what I'm saying, that government is doing so much, but probably at the wrong place. So much resources are being spent on these different schemes, the tractors and this and that and all that, and you give subsidies, 50%, 40%. Instead of that, more focus should be on community investment, where you create infrastructure rather than giving loans to individual farmers or individual companies at subsidized prices or capital subsidies. It will not, the e-NAM will not work. Now take an example I just of mega food parks. I think there are several mega food parks have been established. Government gives subsidy of 50 crores per mega food park. What we have done in mega food park is create other band of traders. What is the role of farmers there? How farmers are integrated with the system? How do the farmers share the benefits of this food park system? So therefore, these concepts have to be changed. I think we will have to create a model or a framework where different supply chains operate. And that education is required, that technical assistance is required. You may give financial support to FPO for registration, for initial subsidy, etc. But how about the management of the supply chain as a whole? So we have to give a lot of emphasis on development of all these FPO systems to manage supply chains. And that technical assistance is very critical. I think until we address this basic problem, I don't think that all these big superstructure markets will function optimally. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think Bhavani, Mr. Deshpande is making a case that there are many good initiatives. Isolated initiatives are necessary but not sufficient. Unless sufficient conditions are met, we will not see take-up. That's what Dr. Alagh also mentioned.
And we have to spend a lot of resources on it. We will need to spend, that's why I say government should rechannel all these subsidy programs to develop this infrastructure for market development. Not individual farmers or individual enterprises or subsidies. So rethinking of the subsidy program, government's program, create public-private partnership is very critical.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Focusing on the technical expertise that Shri Deshpande mentioned, the next question is to Shri Anil Epur. How can India leverage blockchain technology in the agriculture sector?
Good point.
That's a damn good question. I don't think I really thought about the blockchain as such, but I thought a lot about the IT and the digital agriculture. And what to me it's amazing is that a country like India, which is so advanced in IT, remote sensing, digital activities, we do not use any of this in our agriculture. 30 years ago, I used to get data from the USDA telling me what the yields, what the volume of crops would be all over the world. So I would know that wheat availability, say, next 10 months from now will be so and so. I could estimate what the price would be. And the Chicago Board of Trade would tell me what the futures, I know what the price would be. Even now in India, we do not have any such feedback to the farmers. I'm amazed that we are not able to tell our farmers in advance of the season what the price will be when at the end of 6 months or 7 months or so when the crops will come in. So the farmer can make educated guess as to what crops it should grow. When he does not have the data or at least the estimate of what the price will be at the end of the season, he goes for his traditional crops, whether it's rice or wheat or sugarcane or whatever. And then you'll have this same surpluses and shortages as happens. The second one that has amazed to me is the question of the technologies that we have in this country, which have been found safe and approved by the scientists, are not being allowed to be implemented. How come we talking about the import of millions of tons of oil seeds or soybeans or whatever it is, which are all made from GM products all over the world, whereas we do not allow our farmers to use the latest GM seeds? You have Professor Dr. Paintal from Delhi who developed this beautiful mustard seed approved by all the scientists, but yet not allowed to be released in this country. This is cutting our own feet. We are denying access to our farmers, the latest of technologies, latest of science, due to political dogma and due to organization with wrong knowledge. To me, is amazing. So I digress from your blockchain, but I'm talking about the knowledge that exists is not being used for the benefit of the farmers. We also have the question of technologies for storages and warehouses and logistics. Are we using it? No. At the village level to the central level, why don't we have automated silos to reduce manpower, to reduce waste, reduce infestation? Why do we still go on with this labor-intensive gunny bag storages? We stacked it to go down, leading to high labor, high wastes, and high infestations. Science, technology is known to us, but unfortunately we don't implement them, and we are paying the price for it. The high post-harvest losses we're talking about, how much of that is due to bad storages? How much of it is to multiple handlings? That what can be done? And again, I can think of a question as that, a supply chain can only be as good as it's allowed to be. I know of JP will also, I don't want to give the name of the company, but they set up a world scale oil processing plant in Andhra Pradesh and introduced sunflower into this country. When they were about to take off, the Asian Commodity Act said you cannot store more than so many tons of sunflower. And sunflower, as you and I know, comes only at the end of the season. So if they had to store only as per the limit, they could never run the plant 12 months in the year. And so as soon as they got an opportunity to sell off, they sold and ran away from it. So the question here is, will the government allow the farmers to fully benefit from what the rest of the world does? From access to technology, access to the latest systems, access to world markets, access to quality controls, etc., etc. So I know I digress from your question, but I hope this makes some sense.
I think very.
I'll just like to add what Sri Anil ji just mentioned. See, the question of blockchain has been used by some exporters who export their horticulture produce to the global market. In fact, this can really replace traceability in the system. You all know that if your horticulture produce has to be accepted by a consumer in Europe, he needs to know what are the good agricultural practices that is being carried out in the country of origin, and who is it, where is it, how, when it is going to be delivered, what is the state of affairs, what are the residue levels. So the blockchain can be really used where, you know, the producer, the transporter, the person who packages it, the people who handle it at the ports, the shippers, the unloading mechanism which takes place in the destination country, and again reloaded onto the transport vehicles and goes finally to their market and then to consumer, because everyone is on the same page. So therefore, traceability system, which is again adds cost to the entire issue, is completely replaced with blockchain. Already some people in Bangalore have started doing it. Some in Pune have also done it. So I think there is great scope. Some people are doing, but they're infinitesimally small. It needs to be scaled up in a very big way.
Thank you for your very.
But this traceability issue has existed for decades. I remember in the late 90s, when we were the largest exporters of seedless grapes to Europe and the US, traceability was an issue. and we had all our computers online for our customers to tap into. So all our laboratory tests which we did were openly accessible to them as with their passwords. So the question of traceability has existed all the time. Blockchain makes it easier. But the question is that we need to be very careful as to what we are promising to deliver. Whether it's pesticide residues or infestation levels or etc., whatever the criteria are, those need to be built into our mindset. Unfortunately, most of our exporters don't have that mindset. We need to get that into.
Thank you. Bhavani?
Sir, so thank you for your comments. It's 6 o'clock now, but considering that so many questions are being asked, I think we can extend the session by another 15-20 minutes.
We also lost time, Maurya, so I think it's
absolutely.
You have no technological problems, right?
No technological problems, so I believe we can go ahead with the questions.
Go ahead with the
Sir, this is to Shri Ramesh Deshpande, and even Dr. Y.K. Alagh can give his comments. You spoke about the China model of agriculture, a decentralized model, where despite low land sizes, their productivity is quite high. So is there anything that India can learn from it, or how has China been able to achieve this kind of a transformation in their agriculture?
Well, I had a chance to work in China for nearly a decade, on like about $1 billion program we did for agricultural development. And we can learn a lot from China. Forget about the border issues and the current climate. The one thing is the accountability. You see, all in China, although it is supposed to be dictatorship or totalitarian government, I was telling earlier that there is a lot of decentralization. So it is the responsibility of the local leaders to see that the agriculture in the region works well. Any problem coming in is reported quickly and the constraint is solved. That is one. Secondly, in 1979, when China introduced major agricultural reforms, dismantling collective farms and other things and giving rights to land, cultivation rights to land to people, production increased. And the government, instead of procuring, 100% procurement the government was doing, they liberalized and government started buying products. Government has to do procurement. Government is trying products at market price. So they allowed the total socialistic planning to go to market-based product. And price was the incentive. And government was not putting MSP in advance or giving subsidizing prices, but they will buy at market price. So India can learn a lot that if you don't have MSP, the government will say we'll buy at market price. And if the farmers really suffer, small farmers, because of on income ground, family ground, we have social safety net to support them. So the first thing is incentives. That is the most important of China. Third is technology transfer. The technology transfer, every region has a research institute and they attend to local problems. And so there is a technology support. The third very important point is, and I remember that when China introduced agricultural reforms, the production started growing at the rate of 10 to 15% per year. Immediately they started investing in processing. That is value addition. So local products will be aggregated locally, and there was no private sector in China. In 1979, there was no private sector. They created special economic entities, give them all the autonomy. They say you bring the technology from abroad. They gave them special incentives. Look at this, the government is not doing this, private sector is doing this, created new private sector. And so the production was backed by aggregation and processing it for different purposes. Corn, they'll make corn syrup, again, an example, or fruit, they'll make fruit cans and pulp and all. But that was encouraged by the government. That is, production program were accompanied by product aggregation, processing, and marketing. Third is technology. I have told you technology transfer. So these are the secrets of China's agricultural success. So it is not that they were ordering people to do that, but they created an incentive. We have to see whether we have incentives in India's agriculture. You see, I don't know whether you have time. If you can take slide 15 from my presentation, just quickly up. Can you?
I want to get that slide ready. Meanwhile, we request Dr. Alagh to make his comments. Dr. Alagh, Would you like to come in? So if we remember you leading our team when you visited China in 2005. You're an expert on Chinese agriculture and Chinese economy. Would you like to comment on what they have done right in agriculture?
Who is saying?
Dr. Alagh is online. If you're online, unmute yourself, sir, and please speak.
I can share it, Shri Ramesh Deshpande's PPT now.
There seems to be some technical glitch from his end. Probably he's trying to rejoin us.
Okay, slide 15. 15.
I should have. I didn't present my whole PowerPoint to save time, but let us talk about.
Are you talking about this slide?
I'm not able to see. Let me take it up. I think I lost one. Yeah. You see, I got it up. See, I just want to go over quickly about 3-4 points which I missed earlier. The one is I said about invisible hand of the market. You have to create incentives. I think our incentives are managed incentives. They are not market-based incentives, and they don't work. Third is we talked about market access. Market access is absolutely problematic. Although some commodities are doing better, but compared to production potential and the marketing potential, it is still very inadequate. We talked about contract farming. Contract farming gave a lot of, before law was passed, some law. Punjab, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana were big way in contract farming. Entire basmati rice production was done through contract farming in Madhya Pradesh. There was no law there, but it worked for last 20 years. So I think we have to give those options. Don't bring too much regulation in contract farming. You leave it to people to do that. Farmers know what is happening. Protect the farmers on if there is injustice or anything, or if they are cheated, of course you protect them, but not in normal conduct of the business. We talked about role of MSP. The one point I did not mention that MSP is actually depressing prices. Because if the government is buying at MSP, all private sector buys at a price lower than MSP. So government buys, say, grain. They are about 30-40 million tons. Rest of the grain is at the disposal of the general market, and there the prices are discounted. Now, in the case of India's export potential, there is a lot of potential. For example, medicinal plants are there, spices are there, fruits and vegetables are there. But fruits and vegetables, every time, and shrimp and fisheries, which suffered very much under COVID-19, has a very big potential for export. Shrimp and fish products, canned products, has huge potential. But the problem is traceability. And therefore, we will have to create a supply chain with this traceability. And I told you again, even supply chains, there is a credit is available to individual enterprise, but not as a system. You see, credit has to go from ultimate buyer down up to the farmer. That link is not there. Farmer has to go for his working capital, processor has to go to his working capital, So if we have to develop integrated capital, we need an integrated credit system for supporting supply chain. And that is what I am talking to NABARD all the time. I keep them in touch, and this is not. Secondly, there is if you have to, as I told you earlier, that there is no project finance available. You see, if we have to do area supply chain development, covers a wide area. There are multiple actors. And there is like kind of a pyramid type system. And we don't have products to support that system. We don't have what is called is based on cash flow system. That is profitability of the project profitability, technical economic feasibility. People invest in different formats. That is, as I told you, equity, debt, and bonds, and other things. We don't have mechanism to create capital. Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan mentioned that capital formation is low. It's bound to be low because except government and a small section of private sector, is invest in agriculture. Nobody is investing because we don't have mechanisms to raise funds, mobilize funds against concrete development projects. So this is how affecting the supply chain development overall. And so we have to see that how do you develop the micro environment for successful supply chain. And in that context, the last point is here that you accelerate revitalization and restructuring of agriculture. Although we are not discussing today the production issues, that is a very critical element of actually fundamental foundation for successful supply chain development. So I think I should stop here and see if I explained the issue adequately. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Bhavani, is Dr. Alagh online, or else we'll go to the next question?
Yeah, we can move to the next question. Sir, moving on to the next topic about subsidies, we all agree that there are wasteful subsidies in agriculture. So the current thinking in the government, how is it? Since we are moving towards PM Kisan, modeled on Raitu Bandhu scheme, what are your comments, Dr. S.K. Pattanayak?
I think, see, the subsidy, there are two issues. Subsidy cannot be altogether eliminated, but at the same time, there are areas in which subsidies should be eliminated to have a better balance in terms of our, the efficiency of spending. Having said that, many of the speakers did mention in their address, especially Dr. Alagh and Mr. Deshpande, that in the credit side, if you see, the credit actually is not going to the real people. In fact, very little, very less number of farmers actually get the credit. They all gravitate to get credit because there is a bunching of taking credit. They take the credit, they rush to the bank before the financial year end. They take it, and then in the month of April, whatever is due to them, they start paying it off. So in other words, the new loan is taken to service the old debt. So it's a rolling over of the loan rather than actually the credit being used for something else. So and secondly, the speakers also mentioned there's hardly any credit for long-term investment. That means medium-term loans. Why? Because this interest subsidy scheme is actually for crop loans, which is seasonal in nature. That is not available for medium-term loans like buying tractors or investing in agriculture. So perhaps there is a need to incentivize medium to long term rather than in the short term. Because short term, what happens, you need it to do agriculture for that year and then it rolls over. So this is one. Secondly, the fertilizer subsidy is again highly skewed. We are giving a lot of subsidy for nitrogenous fertilizer, that is urea. As a result, people are using urea in excess. And the phosphatic fertilizers, the potash, they are not at all used. As a result, there is no balanced use of fertilizer. The productivity in India is less. To correct that also, we should disincentivize, or we must incentivize in such a way there is more better use of subsidies. But we must realize that farmers are poor people. They may need some degree of subsidy. Agriculture, in fact, has a very high level of subsidy. The WTO has been saying that you, instead of giving subsidy to individuals, you can, this is not WTO friendly. You can perhaps load it elsewhere, which is WTO friendly. Well, that's a debatable point, and we would still need. In fact, now that the PM Kisan has worked well, the time is ripe to think of making this movement so that the leakage can be reduced to substantial extent. I would like to borrow also the idea of Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan when he mentioned that in a fully functioning market, there is no need to give food subsidy in the manner in which we are administering food subsidy. Because in fully functioning market, cash vouchers have proven to be successful. Many countries, in Western countries, cash vouchers have been successful. The World Food Programme has carried out a lot of research in different countries. And India is already we have a fully functioning food market. There is no dearth of goods anywhere. I think cash voucher would be a better option in the Indian marketing system today. And that will also incentivize the farmer to really grow. Because that will have, then the leakages will be low, the storage losses will be low, the transportation is not required. We'll have a lean and thin bureaucracy and all this. So these are some of the areas where I think government has identified, but it needs political will to implement them.
Thank you, Dr. Pattanayak.
Can I add one point, Dr. Jayaprakash, one quick point?
Yes,
Can
please.
I add one point? You see, China has abolished interest subsidies on agricultural rates, number one. And they have decentralized completely to provincial level. Why they said? Because interest subsidies are restricting supply of credit. Because banks need enough spread to cover their transaction costs. And that's what we are not doing. We are using nationalized banks to channel all this money and not covering their transaction costs. So they don't want to lend. They are risk averse and there is no profitability. So I think totally make agricultural credit market-based. Let interest, let bank, every bank, and banks, let banks compete to make more efficient credit business. So like any other subsidy, this interest subsidy is actually hurting farmers than helping them. If 20% farmers are getting credit and get interest subsidy, and 80% don't get, whom are we helping? And banks are carrying huge NPAs and losing money. So we have to change this whole credit policy system to suit the new agriculture. I think that is a very important recommendation you can take. That you have to think about, and government can go into capital subsidies on social safety. You see, if you have a strong social safety net, you don't need all these subsidies to go. We are just creating, as you rightly said, for distortion. So you have to see these three things together. Poorer farmers, small farmers, whether do they have adequate social safety net? That is about food security, about education, about health, and about shelter. If they get that, then the rest of the thing can move to the market. And it is a process, but it will take time. So currently, I will stop here. Currently, financial markets are in bad shape, and the subsidies are not helping neither farmers nor them. Okay, thank you.
Deshpande sir, from what you say, what's impressive about China is A, decentralization. B, for a communist country, it is governed by communist party.
Yeah.
No compulsory procurement, no controls, but market-oriented policies and purchase on the market if the government needs it.
Absolutely.
Third, aggregation and investment in processing.
Yeah, but one caveat that poorer farmers will be supported by social safety, not by MSP or not by interest subsidies.
Dr. Alagh has not joined us yet. Okay.
May I come in with one point here?
Yes, Anil.
Our takeaway we take from what Dr. Pattanayak and Mr. Ramesh Deshpande said about the access to credit of everybody in the supply chain trying to get credit for their little operations. If we really had a proper supply chain and a contract farming system in place, the end buyer would take the credit and then he would be the guy who would supply the agri inputs required by the farmers. I do this many decades ago, by which every single non-labor input for our contract farmers we used to provide. And at the end of the season, from whenever the supply date, we would deduct the value of these inputs without any interest. And so therefore the borrowing from the credit borrowing was done only by the company. The farmers did not have to take any loans for their operations. So this is, I think, a model that existed, has disappeared, but probably could come back in a modern form.
Thank you, Anil.
Yes, sir.
Maria?
Sir, because of the paucity of time, we'll take last couple of questions. This question is addressed to you, Dr. JP. More than half of our cold storage infrastructure is mainly situated in 4 states, and 3/4 of the existing cold storage is being used to only store potatoes. Why does this disparity exist, and how can it be addressed?
No, I think we have discussed it earlier that the gap in cold storage probably is more like 50-60%, not 10% as the government in one of the reports claimed. Because even the government's earlier reports indicate that 35 million tons of additional cold storage is required. That was some years ago. We are nowhere near that. The second is, again, in the report is pointed out and the government itself acknowledged, though investment in cold storage is not prohibited, it's not coming in because across the whole supply chain, you're not allowing investment unless the big retail chains are allowed to invest. Individually on cold storage, is very difficult to make big investments and then make them profitable, unless the whole value chain proposition is addressed adequately. And somehow in India, we take endless time in debating and then finalizing a policy. After finalizing and deciding on a policy, whenever there is political inconvenience or a slight opposition from some source or other without any evidence or logic, we quickly shut down the tap again. Now, this blowing hot and blowing cold doesn't really happen. One day you export, next year you ban. Even if next year you open up exports, your supply chain is interrupted and people lose confidence in you as a supplier. Similarly, in investment cycle, if you have these kinds of policies which are only half-hearted, only bits and pieces, it yields some dividends, as earlier pointed out, but the sufficient condition is not fulfilled. Therefore, in my judgment, there's no substitute to having an integrated approach as China has, and with the end result in mind, that we need value addition, higher produce from agriculture, higher outcomes, higher incomes to the farmers and everybody across the chain, unless we have the clarity, and then work backward with all the linkages. Piecemeal approach will give us some incremental benefits here and there, but the quantum leap that India desperately needs, that eludes us. And that certainly is true with agriculture.
I'd just like to add to what you said. See, actually, why these 4 states? Today, if you see, anyway, cereals don't need cold storages. What needs cold storages are actually perishables. And among the most traded perishable is potato. Potato, onion is not so much amenable to cold storage in a conventional sense. They need aerated storages. So it is not a model for that. Tomato, you know, is also not amenable. Maximum you can store tomato maybe 5 days, 7 days, not beyond that. But potato can be stored up to 9 to 10 months. So therefore, when potato is harvested, they're stored for almost 9 to 10 months till the next season. And therefore, the cold storages will be mostly in Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, and another 2 states where potato is produced. It can be in another state where potato is not produced. That is the reason why potato storages are there, and they are mostly located.
And in addition to the fact that Pepsi and companies like that entered in a big way with contract farming and processing, that linkage is established. Yes, Mauri.
Sir, there is a paucity of time, but there is no paucity of questions. But if we can get a quick concluding comments from all the panelists in, say, less than 30 seconds.
Let me start.
Anil?
I would like to see the day that we are like the most developed countries, where as a thumb rule, on an average, the farmers get 1/3 of the consumer price, the processors get 1/3, and the trade distributor etc. gets 1/3. However, for fresh produce, the farmers and the trade get a larger share. That I think is the worldwide kind of a thing there. So a farmer should not get less than 33% for a highly processed product, to a much larger percentage for a fresher produce. I think this can certainly be done, and it should be there. The second one is you should follow the Dutch model, where the farmers become farm to smaller cooperatives or whatever you call them, which federate into a larger ones. And as per by product line, they fix the base price below which they will not sell to anybody. So the milk producers of Federation will sell, we will not sell milk below this price to anybody. You have to buy more than that, whether it's tomatoes or whether it's flowers or whatever it is. Our farmers must get that strength. They should be able to have a say in the market prices. Just 2 comments.
Thank you, Anil. Dr. Pattanayak?
See, I can tell in a nutshell, see, India is always aspiring to be the superpower in the world. In fact, India can be truly an agricultural superpower. And why I say this? Because of a different aspect altogether. Just take the example. There is no country in the world which can meet the agricultural demand of this country. So we can destabilize global markets. In fact, these were the words of the US president when in 2008 and 9, India imported 5.5 million tons of wheat, and it stopped good grain supply to as many as 20 to 30 different countries in the world, because global suppliers will supply to the biggest consumer. And then we, if we want, we can use this power to really harm other countries. but that is not our intention. So if you want to become a superpower, we must invest in agriculture, and we can really become. Today, India is the biggest producer of rice in the world. Few years back, we are nowhere in that trade. You take any example, I can keep on saying. So let us dream of becoming a global agricultural superpower.
Mr. Deshpande?
Yeah, I have two comments. One is we have to begin to turn agriculture into agribusiness using the invisible hand of the market. So we have to see how we reduce regulations, how we reduce subsidies. Secondly, we should rationalize the whole subsidy system. That is very important because it has become a disincentive rather than incentive. It is only helping few and ignoring majority. So 2 points: how to turn agriculture into agribusiness using market forces. Number one, what all needs to be done. Number two, make government expenditure go from individual subsidies to community subsidies to building market infrastructure. That is what. That will help a lot of people rather than giving this. I should stop.
Dr. Alagh,
Final comment. He's not been able to join because of certain technical glitches, but final comments from you, Dr.
I'll make a few comments and then I'll leave it to you to propose a formal vote of thanks. I think we have to go back to basics. Even now, 45 to 48% of our population largely depends on agriculture for their sustenance. While we all recognize that ultimately the industries and services, their share in the economy of any modern country will continue to grow. Therefore, the share of agriculture will continue to fall. That's understandable. But when the agriculture still sustains almost half the population with only 16 or 17% of the share of the GDP, we simply cannot afford to ignore it. Only when agriculture is thriving can the rest of the sectors survive. And two, as Dr. Pattanayak pointed out very aptly, with tremendous strengths, 12% of agricultural land and thousands of years of agricultural tradition, our farmers have proved time and again, the Green Revolution being one. In the 1960s, I don't think anybody believed that within about a decade's time, India would be able to produce enough food grains to feed itself. We were regarded as a basket case, and people projected scenarios of millions of Indians dying of starvation. Today, we have the largest food grain surplus in the peak season anywhere in the world. When our production was 50 million tons in 1950, peak time government granary storage of food grains is 80 million tons. There's no country which can match this. So our farmers, however disadvantaged they are remarkably entrepreneurial and capable of producing a great deal. But we are giving them a raw deal. We're not giving them technology. There was a time some years ago when India came very close to actually banning for 15 years genetic technologies. Only a country that is desperate to commit suicide will do these things. A last-minute intervention from some of us approaching the Prime Minister's office and giving them a solid dressing down, and then the intervention of the government very aggressively, that saved the day. This is absurd. We cannot have ad hoc approach to agriculture. It's not merely enough to gather the votes because rural population still counts a great deal electorally. We have to look at agricultural economics very seriously, systematically, rationally, and scientifically. The holy cows, the traditional approach, the shibboleths, the language we used for 50 years, the ideas which are hackneyed we used for 50 years, may not be relevant always to current conditions globally and nationally. I think we must go by the evidence and logic. Today's effort is a modest attempt to bring evidence and logic to agricultural policy. And the rest of it, the farmers of India, the entrepreneurs of India, the consumers of India, they will take care. That is our basic belief. And that is the belief well tested all over the world and in our own country. The benefit and the opportunity we give to the other sectors, let us give to agriculture. And none of the proposals mean a lot of money from the government. We understand the fiscal constraints. There's no point asking the government to give us trillions of rupees. It's not possible. Just judiciously redirect the expenditure wisely so that it will give best value for the country, greatest income, most jobs and export competitiveness and internal value addition. It's possible. We cannot do 100%, but we can do 90%. We still will depend on the rest of the world. They'll depend on us. We're an interdependent world, but India can emerge as a world champion. I hope that's the message we'll carry. and we give up some of the shibboleths and traditional practices merely because of efflux of time, not necessarily because they stood the test of time or they are the best responses to today's conditions. Maurya?
Thank you, sir. Thank you to the distinguished panelists, and thank you to the audience who've been patient enough to listen to us, the incredible energy shown. And we sincerely apologize for all the technical glitches at our end. We tried our best, but because of thunderstorms and certain other things, the internet connection was a bit unstable. Regardless, I hope you all had a good time. Before we wind up, I just like to show one more slide. Talking about our next webinar, which is on big city governance. Here we are collaborating with another NGO, popular with expertise in urban governance called Janagraha. And next week, same time, same day, please tune in. We'll share all the links with you. Thank you once again for being a part of this webinar. Once again, we apologize for the technical glitches. Have a good day.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, Team FDR.
Thank you. Thank you.
Follow it up. Whatever we thought, we hope that we will sit with the governments at the national and state level and pursue it, and continue to persuade the media and the general public and the policymakers in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Once again.